So I think we have the pleasure of having Niriyal with us, so it's time to start. A little bit late, but that should be okay. So welcome everybody to this research seminar. It's at the Institute of Future Studies, but in collaboration with, and in that sense at the Center for Population Level Bioethics at Rutgers University, which is a nice collaboration with Niriyal, who's running this new center. Nir, would you like to say some words about this collaboration?
Just that we are delighted to start a collaboration. We already had a joint seminar, and we're looking forward to many sessions together, public and kind of smaller seminars. Do people know what TPLB is? Our center? Shall I say something about this, or?
Maybe, or if you want, you can say.
Sure. So we are dedicated. So CPLB, the Center for Population Level Bioethics at Rutgers, is a special center. It doesn't do clinical bioethics, which is what most bioethics is about. It does policy bioethics. It's at the population level. So think about paternalistic health policies and their morality. Think about distributive questions, how to distribute vaccines between Princeton and Trenton and New Jersey, or between the global north and the global south, how to distribute resources between generations so that we don't leave future generations in a lurch. So questions about how to measure all of this, raise also normative inquiries, and we do all of that.
Yeah, so that sounds excellent, and of course it overlaps with a lot of what we do here at the Institute of Future Studies. So I also am very happy about this collaboration, and it's also very fitting then to have Daniel Hausman with us today, who's going to speak, who is quite recently a research professor at the Center for Population Level Bioethics. He received his PhD some time back in '78 at Columbia University, and since then he has written extensively and published extensively on in the boundaries between economics and philosophy. And not surprisingly, he was one of the co-founders of the journal Economics and Philosophy. And he has also written a lot about health, and some books, I just mentioned some of the, I think in total is 11 books, but one book is Valuing Health, Wellbeing, Freedom and Suffering from Oxford University Press in 2015. And there is Economic Analysis, Moral Philosophy and Public Policy, Cambridge University Press, together with Deborah Satz and Malcolm McPherson, latest edition in 2017. And then a well-known book from many of us, Preference, Value and Choice and Welfare, Cambridge University Press in 2011. And in addition, a vast number of articles. And today, Dan is going to talk to us about what is a fair allocation of healthcare, a quite foundational question. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to speak to you. This talk is actually drawn from a book manuscript currently under consideration at Oxford University Press, dealing with questions about the fairness of the use of cost-effectiveness analysis. I'll have very little to say about cost-effectiveness today. So let me share my screen. So I'm going to raise the question, what is a fair allocation of healthcare? And I'm going to point out how difficult that question is. And unfortunately, I'm not going to give you any satisfactory answer to the question. So some of you may want to sign off at this point. A few introductory comments. Clearly, what one might call formal fairness, simply impartially enforcing whatever kind of rule one has is not sufficient for fairness. It's an element of fairness, but it's not sufficient for fairness. And I think there's a fairly widespread intuition that fairness involves, it may be more than this, but it involves equal satisfaction of claims. It gives people what they deserve, in some sense or other deserve, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm going to make use of the notion of claims as laid out in John Broome's work, and this talk is going to be a commentary on Broome's view of fairness, about which I'll have some reservations. So what I mean by a claim is that an individual has a claim when some other agent or representative agents has a duty to give them something. So we're talking about something that's a little bit, that's like a right, although it's not, it's certainly not meant to be absolute. It's going to be divisible, but the idea is that people will have certain sorts of entitlements, and fairness is a matter of how we respond to those entitlements that individuals have. A fair, I think it's widely believed that a fair distribution of goods is going to be properly responsive to the relevant features of the claimants of those goods, and it's not going to be responsive to irrelevant properties. Now that, although true perhaps, is not going to be very helpful until we fill in what we mean by properly responsive. When we're talking about healthcare, we're going to be talking about claims which are unequal in strength and different in kind. Clearly, the claims that someone might have for treatment for their acne is going to be quite different than the claims that someone else might have for treatment of their advanced cancer. I'm concerned with fairness as one among several moral considerations. So it may well be that the fairest thing to do is not the morally right thing to do, because there are other things that we're concerned about, such as efficiency or freedom. Okay, so those are just a few introductory comments. Here's an outline of what I'm going to be doing in the talk. First, and most unsatisfactory will be the first section of the paper, which will consist of some vague generalizations concerning fairness. One advantage of putting it at the beginning of the paper is that by the time the paper is over, you may have forgotten how unsatisfactory this part of the paper really is. I'm then going to lay out John Broome's view of the fair allocation of divisible goods and his view of the fair allocation of indivisible goods. I'm then going to talk about claims to healthcare, and indeed whether individuals have claims to healthcare and what the strength of those claims might be. I'm then going to shift, rather than thinking about the fair distribution of healthcare, thinking about the fair allocation of access to healthcare. I'll then dwell a little bit more on the note of on the question of how costs bear on the fairness of access to healthcare, and conclude. So here are the vague foundational comments that I want to make, and I apologize that they aren't more precisely formulated. I don't know how to formulate them more precisely. So the basic idea of fairness that seems intuitively plausible to me is something like what I call equal baseline, or in Steve Darwall's terminology, recognition respect for all beings who are capable of rationally supervising their own conduct. And that's what I take to be what I'm calling a rational being. And that rational beings are capable of evaluating their actions. That's obviously something that human beings can do. And evaluating the actions of others. And people are capable of defending their actions with reasons that all rational beings can, at least in principle, endorse. Hence, their actions and their reasons are subject to the scrutiny of others. That plausibly suggests, at least, that rational beings have a particular standing, as it were, to make claims of other rational beings, and claims once again are meant to be obligations directed toward individuals. And baseline respect consists in recognition of claims and responsiveness to claims. Fairness in this sense is not necessarily comparative, but like Broome, I'm going to be focusing on fairness as a comparative notion. And other moral concerns which one might think of as non-comparative fairness, I think of as considerations of justice rather than fairness. Ultimately, I think it's largely a terminological issue, but I'm going to be talking about fairness mostly as a comparative notion. Just to situate what I'm talking about, I think it's fairly close to what Rawls means by reciprocity, which isn't very helpful because it's very hard to tell what Rawls does mean by reciprocity. And I think I'm in the same ballpark here as Tim Scanlon in his rather well-known formulation that a distribution would be unfair if and only if it would be disallowed by principles governing the distribution of benefits and burdens that no one could reasonably reject as a basis for informed, unforced general agreement. Indeed, I think what I'm talking about here is at least a second cousin of what Aristotle talks about in Book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about justice as a matter of giving individuals what they deserve. And this notion of desert has been very prominent in the work of my colleague here at Rutgers, Larry Temkin. I think it's useful to think about desert, but dangerous to do so because I think there are huge ambiguities. And I think it's useful to distinguish at least four notions of desert. And they're on the slide here. The first notion is what I call rule-determined desert, that each of us deserves what justified institutions and practices guarantee to us. So, example I like to use, probably an unfamiliar one to Swedes, is in baseball. If someone hits a ball that stays in fair territory and bounces into the stands so it can't be retrieved, then the individual deserves to be on second base. And desert here is not a matter of intrinsic moral worth or anything like that. That's just what the rules say. Related to rule-determined desert, there's what I call duty-defined desert. That is that we deserve what others are obligated to do for us on grounds other than desert. Obviously, if they were obligated on grounds of desert, we'd have an unenlightening tautology here. There's also a notion, which I'm very skeptical of making much use of in political philosophy, like Rawls, of intrinsic or what I call rule-determining desert, which would be moral merit or virtue. And in this sense, the distribution of good or ill fortune is fair, if only if it's in some sense equivalent to the merit of the individual. And this is clearly the notion of desert that figures in retributive views of punishment, for example. And as I said, I think it's very problematic because I think determining what someone really deserves is a job for God, not for us. And then there's what I call Kantian desert. That's what's due to rational agents in virtue of their having the status of being self-assessing rational agents. So when we're thinking about fair principles and their implementation to any question, and of course the question I'm concerned about is the fair allocation of healthcare, I think it's important to distinguish between two different issues. One is whether the assignment of claims and their strength is fair. Whether the claims of individuals conform to their desert in a rule determining or a Kantian notion of desert. The idea is that it's not as if individuals spring from the womb with certain kinds of with a set of claims. Rather, the moral system or the set of laws that exist in a society assign to individuals claims, and that assignment of claims itself raises issues of fairness. So one could perfectly well imagine a slave society in which all the claims that are recognized in the society are well satisfied, but the slaves are simply not taken to have any claims at all. And obviously such a society would be grossly unfair. So what claims individuals have is itself an important issue of fairness. It's one which John Broome in his work, which as I said, I'm going to be commenting on, doesn't address. It's not as if he denies that there are questions of fairness there, but rather his account starts with, whatever claims, hopefully justified claims there happen to be. The second issue is whether the satisfaction of claims, when they can't be fully satisfied, is fair. That is, whether they give people what they deserve of what is available in what I would call a rule-dependent or a duty-defined sense of desert. And it's this latter question which occupies Broome. The first question is an important question as well with respect to what would constitute the fair allocation of healthcare. So I'm then going to turn to Broome's view of the fair allocation of divisible goods. In Broome's view, claims, and remember what claims are, should be satisfied, not merely weighted in proportion to their strength. So for example, suppose that A and B, two individuals, both have a claim to a sandwich. And suppose that A's claim is twice as strong as B's. It might be that A needs the food more or whatever. A fair distribution would give A 2/3 of the sandwich and give B 1/3 of the sandwich. And I think this is perfectly plausible, but there are other things that we might say. Why not instead satisfy as fully as possible the strongest claim and then offer compensation to the individuals whose claims are not being satisfied? So for example, we might give the sandwich to A, since A has a claim that's twice as strong, and give B a consolation prize, as it were, of an apple. There's also a question of whether fairness is only comparative. So one way to satisfy A and B's claims in a perfectly fair way is not to satisfy their claims at all. Then each of them receives the same proportion of what they have a claim to, namely nothing, and they're treated completely impartially and arguably perfectly fairly. But clearly, it's a morally unsatisfactory solution in most cases, and so there's a real question about whether one wants to build into the notion of fairness that one does as much as possible to satisfy claims, or is it enough that one's satisfaction of claims is completely equal or impartial? Broome opts for the latter, and I think that to some extent we have a terminological issue here, because it's not as if whether claims get satisfied is morally indifferent, but it's not something that's going to enter into fairness with respect to Broome's view of fairness. And just a last remark here, which I'll be saying a lot more about, is it's really not clear how to satisfy claims to healthcare in proportion to their strength. So let me move on then to Broome's view of the fair allocation of indivisible goods, because healthcare is often indivisible. Now, indivisible isn't a matter of just physically dividing. We can cut an apple in half, and half an apple is roughly half as good as having the whole apple, and so you can think of an apple as a divisible good. A baseball we can cut in half as well, but of course or a football we can cut in half, but of course half a football or half a baseball is not half the good of a football or baseball. So in the case of indivisible goods, we're not going to be cutting them up. They're going to go to some of the individuals who have claims to them, and they're not going to go to other individuals who have claims to them. And as a result, the distribution of the goods themselves is not going to be fair. There's no way to have a fair distribution of the goods. However, we can allocate chances to receive the goods in a way that's fair. So suppose that A and B both have claims to a baseball, and that A's claims are twice as strong as B's. A should get the baseball if a die lands with 1, 2, 3, or 4 showing, that is with a probability 2/3. B should get the baseball with a probability of 1/3, and that way their chances of receiving the good is proportional to the strength of their claims. Now, Broome is actually, I've used the word cagey about whether he's endorsing proportional lotteries at all. And it may be that a proper interpretation of his work is that he's only defending lotteries among equal or almost equal claimants, because he's perfectly sensibly concerned that if we hold a proportional lottery, then, although with a lesser probability, the good may go to an individual who has a weaker claim. But it's not clear to me that his qualms about proportional lotteries are actually qualms about their fairness. And it seems to me that given the philosophical motivation in his view, that he should be committed to proportional lotteries. In any case, I'm going to take his view as committed to proportional lotteries. Broome talks about that if we distribute probabilities in proportion to the strength of claims, then what we're doing is providing what he calls a surrogate satisfaction of those claims. And that our concern about the fairness of allocation of individual goods is thus focused entirely on the distribution of chances. And the chances he's concerned with, although this isn't something that is perfectly, it's not something specified in the article, but I think it really needs to be objective chances. And here's an example of mine, which I call Brian and Betty's coin flip. Whether Brian or Betty gets a good is to be determined by flipping a coin, which is believed to have Brian printed on one side and Betty printed on the other side. However, owing to a manufacturing malfunction of which no one is ever aware, both sides have Brian's name on them. Now, in Broome's view, the distribution of epistemic probabilities is not enough to constitute fair treatment of Brian and Betty's. Epistemically, everyone thinks that that Brian and Betty have an equal chance of getting the good. With respect to everyone's epistemic probability, prior to the flip, everyone believes that the probability is 50-50. But although it would be believed that the distribution of chances was fair, it would not actually be the case that the distribution of chances was fair. And Broome writes, it was never on the cards that she might actually get the good that she has a claim to. So the idea is that in the case of indivisible goods, what we want to do is distribute objective chances to individuals that are proportional to the strength of their claims to those goods. Now, here's an objection to Broome's view. I'm quoting from a notorious essay, indeed, by John Torek, which isn't directed toward Broome, who indeed was written 13 years before Broome's essay was published. The example reads as follows. Volcanic eruptions have placed the lives of many inhabitants in immediate jeopardy. A large number, and the 100 is my insertion, are gathered at the north end of the island awaiting evacuation. A handful, that is 5 individuals, find themselves on the southern tip. Imagine the captain of the only Coast Guard evacuation ship in the area finding himself midway between the two. Where shall he head first? Well, in Broome's view, the fairest thing for the Coast Guard ship to do is not to rescue anybody. Everybody's treated perfectly equally that way. It's not as if he would ever endorse such a thing, because obviously it would throw away people's lives, which is of tremendous importance, but it would be perfectly fair. The next fairest thing to do in Broome's view is to flip a coin. And one might object to that, saying, if you have a choice between saving 100 people and saving 5 people, to flip a coin would be outrageous. You're giving a 50-50 chance of saving just 5 people and allowing 95 unnecessary deaths. I mean, that might not matter to Torek, but that's a different issue here. I'm not concerned with Torik's views. And I think what Broome could say in response is, of course, there's overwhelming reason to save the 95 as opposed to save the 100 as opposed to save the 5, but it's not a fairness reason. That what's fair is to give everyone an equal chance of surviving. However, in this case, other considerations apart from fairness take priority. But I'm not, and I think that's a reasonable response, but I'm not sure that it's entirely satisfactory. One could certainly imagine that before this event occurs, various kinds of rules or policies are specified for the Coast Guard, and it's not at all surprising, it's not at all implausible to suppose that there would be unanimous agreement in this ex-ante position to have a policy that one should save as many individuals as possible. Now, there's going all the way back to Rawls, there's an objection to veil of ignorance arguments, and in a sense this is like a veil of ignorance argument, this ex-ante argument, before you know whether you might be one of these individuals in need of evacuation. And there's an objection that it doesn't take the separateness of individuals seriously. A utilitarian argument from the veil of, from behind the veil of ignorance might give everyone the highest expectation, but it might have the highest expectation by sacrificing some individuals to benefit others. But that objection to general veil of ignorance arguments really doesn't apply here, because those who are going to be worst off, depending on whether the ship goes north or whether it goes south, are going to be dead. So the worst off are going to be in the same position, whether you save the 100 or save the 5. And of course, there'll be fewer worse off if you save the 100. And how could it possibly be unfair to follow a policy that would be unanimously agreed to in an ex-ante, from an ex-ante perspective, and in which the worst off are fewer than any alternative policy, and no worse off than they would be with an alternative policy. So it's not clear that Broome's view of fairness is defensible. At least there's an important challenge here. So let me move on then to talk about claims to healthcare and their strength. Those of you who are not philosophers may say, at last, we're going to talk about healthcare. So the first question is whether individuals have any claims to healthcare, and if so, how strong are they, and who's obligated to satisfy those claims? Well, my view of the matter is that I think all of us have imperfect duties to aid other individuals. And by an imperfect duty, I mean a duty which others cannot demand of us. It's not as if, for example, I think we have imperfect duties to provide certain amount of charity to those who are worse off than we are. But it's not that any individual who's worse off than I am can come and demand of me that I satisfy their needs or make them better off. Rather, an imperfect duty is, as it were, sort of vague in its requirements. And the imperfect duties we have to aid people who are ill and suffering, I think, are rather vague, and it's hard, if we're thinking just one individual as opposed to other individuals, to think about exactly how to satisfy it. However, I think that what we rationally do and should do is we construct agencies who have and we transfer to them our imperfect duties to aid, and those agencies that we construct to fulfill our imperfect duties to aid have obligations to do so in an efficient way and in a fair way. And it's via the construction of agencies to carry out our imperfect duties that individuals acquire claims to healthcare. Their claims are ultimately they're against all of us, but they're against us with respect to the agencies that we've constructed to carry out those obligations. And I'm simply going to assume for the rest of the paper that we're concerned with a universal healthcare system that has a fixed budget. And I put an asterisk here because there's, in addition, further questions about fairness that I'm not going to address concerning how large that budget ought to be. And so I'm just flagging that. I'm not going to talk about it further. So we're going to have a universal healthcare system with a fixed budget that defines what claims individuals have to healthcare, of what strength, and the objective, of course, is to improve people's health and well-being in a fair way, whatever that is. And of course, we haven't made much, we haven't advanced much in terms of resolving that. Sorry. So I'm then going to make the following assumption about the claims to healthcare that we have, which I'll call the health claims assumption. I'm going to say that claims to healthcare and the strength of those claims depend exclusively on, first of all, the properties and consequences of health deficiencies, which I take to fall under two headings: suffering of various sorts and activity limitations. Secondly, it's going to depend on the availability and properties of treatments. I certainly don't have a claim to a treatment which is completely inefficacious or which doesn't exist altogether. Thirdly, my claims to health are going to depend on principles governing the healthcare system, which I take to be a number: benevolence, compassion, fairness, autonomy, solidarity, and opportunity. That may not be exhaustive. And I also think that costs are going to be relevant to claims for healthcare. Now, there's going to be some other sources of claims to healthcare, which I'm just sort of setting aside. So, for example, if the medical system has caused some harm to me, there may be a special claim there to certain recompense or to further treatment. And if individuals are allowed to buy private insurance to supplement universal health care, the result of purchasing supplemental insurance would give rise to other claims. But again, I'm sort of setting those to aside. What about the strength of claims? Well, I take the strength of claims as depending upon the severity of someone's health condition if they're not treated, as depending on how much improvement treatment can bring, as depending on the cost of treatments. And then we have the question, well, when is the distribution of healthcare proportional to the strength of claims, which is, of course, the question we need to ask if we're employing John Broome's theory of fairness. And I think we run into a big problem here, which I call the heterogeneity problem. Individuals have claims of different kinds, of different quantities, of different strength, to varying quantities of different kinds of healthcare. Some of it's divisible, much of it is indivisible. The question then is, when are heterogeneous responses to heterogeneous claims proportional to the strength of the claims? For example, Maria needs surgery for a brain tumor. Martha needs penicillin for pneumonia. Martin needs physical therapy to be able to walk. How does one allocate the surgery, physical therapy, penicillin, and muscle relaxants with their differing costs, risks, and efficacies fairly among Maria, Martha, and Martin, under the assumption that we don't have resources to give everybody everything that that they have a claim to. It's a sobering question. It's a really difficult question, and it's of course a question that universal healthcare systems have to somehow or other answer. Well, how might we adapt Broome's theory to cut through this rather horrendous problem of heterogeneity? Well, what we might do is to reconceive of claims, not as claims to specific kinds of healthcare, but rather as claims to health improvement. And we might measure health improvement in terms of QALYs, that is, quality adjusted life years, or we might have some other measure of increases in well-being, the idea being that our healthcare system isn't just devoted to improving health, it may be devoted to improving well-being even when there is no improvement in health. So if one's thinking of palliative care, for example, palliative care may bring some improvements in health, but it may not, but it may be fully successful without doing so. And the strength of claims in this interpretation would depend upon some measure of health or well-being if untreated, such as QALYs, and the quality increases the treatments provide. And whether distribution of healthcare is fair is still not going to be easy to tell. We can't tell by looking at the array of health outcomes. In any given society, the array of health outcomes depends very, very heavily on many things that have nothing to do with healthcare. And so you can have one healthcare system that's far more, that with the same budget is far more effective and far fairer with a worse distribution of health outcomes because of other things, such as people's behaviors, such as climate, such as the contingencies of how they've dealt with pandemics, which is obviously on everyone's minds right now. So we can't judge whether the distribution of healthcare is fair by looking at health outcomes. We certainly can't judge it by looking at the array of health expenditures. Cheap healthcare is sometimes much more efficacious than expensive healthcare. Antibiotics, which are very, very inexpensive, may be life-saving, while extremely expensive procedures may be largely futile. And of course, we can't really tell anything by just looking at the actual array of distribution of healthcare itself, that is, at least without conditioning it on the array of health conditions in the society. So it seems to me that what one really ought to be concerned with in thinking about the fair distribution of healthcare is what I call fair access. And what I mean by access is just simply that one can have the treatment for the asking, provided that one has a medical need for the treatment. So I have access to a particular treatment if indeed I have a medical need for that treatment, and I can have it if I ask for it. Now, one might initially, superficially, and mistakenly suppose that all we really need for the fair allocation of healthcare is equal access to some specified set of treatments, and this set of treatments is going to be limited, of course, by the budget one has. But if you think about it, that's certainly not going to be sufficient for the fair allocation of healthcare. Imagine, for example, a society which does not include in the specified set of treatments to which individuals have access, treatments for conditions which are exclusive to women. Obviously, such an arrangement would not be fair. So what we need to do is we need to say, well, fair access to healthcare is going to be equal access to a fair set of treatments. And of course, one feels like one's chasing one's tail here, because we've got the question of fairness arising again with respect to how do we specify a set of treatments subject to a budget constraint, which is to which everyone will have equal access, which is fair, which includes, as it were, the right set of treatments. Now, it seems to me that however we work this out, we're not going to satisfy Broome's conditions. I don't think it would be impossible to satisfy Broome's conditions, but it would be very bizarre. So the problem with Broome's conditions is if we allow access to a particular treatment to be available to everyone in the society, it will be equally available to individuals who have strong claims and who have weak claims. And so the proportionality of the, in this case, access to healthcare to the strength of claims isn't going to be satisfied. And the only way to satisfy that would be to have individuals who have strong claims have, let's say, guaranteed access to certain conditions. Individuals who have weaker claims, we hold a lottery, and with a certain probability they get access to those claims or not. One might work out a system like that, but it's hard to believe that that could be effectively done. Certainly, whether it could be done in a way that would be acceptable in any recognizable society is questionable. I don't think that Broome's views are operational, as it were, with respect to access to healthcare. And there's further questions, which I'm not going to discuss, about responsibility, individual insurance choices. What about costs? Well, obviously, costs have to have a role in the allocation of healthcare. That is, unless we have a budget which is sufficient to provide all the healthcare that could be in any way efficacious or useful to individuals in the society. So clearly, costs are going to have a big role in determining what healthcare people have access to, what healthcare we don't give individuals access to. And this is going to be a very difficult, painful choice, particularly in societies that are not nearly as affluent as Sweden or the United States. So clearly costs are going to have a role, but is it fair that they play a role? Well, here's an example that might suggest that it isn't fair, but that's not the moral I'm going to draw from it. So here's the example of George and Georgina. They both need an antibiotic to avoid losing a leg. George needs a course of an inexpensive antibiotic. Georgina needs an expensive antibiotic, which she cannot afford because she has an infection that is resistant to the inexpensive antibiotic. The health system refuses to pay for the expensive antibiotic, and she loses a leg. Well, does fairness demand that Georgina have some chance of being treated, or that she be treated altogether? And a naive application of Broome's view would suggest that fairness does require that she have some chance of being treated. But I think that's the wrong question to ask for one main reason. When we're thinking about the fair allocation of health care, I think that we have to avoid looking at some particular individuals who have particular claims and how healthcare satisfies or fails to satisfy those claims. The healthcare system is a system that continues over time, and in which individuals, unless they are lucky or very lucky, will from time to time have differing needs and hence differing claims to healthcare. And an individual who is deprived of healthcare with respect to one problem at one time may be treated on another occasion, much better than the individuals who I'm not expressing this very clearly. What I have in mind is there's built into any kind of continuing relationship like a healthcare system is a kind of turn taking, that sometimes individuals are going to be winners, as it were, sometimes they're going to be losers, and a proper application of a theory of fairness doesn't look at these piecemeal and doesn't say, oh, turn taking is incredibly unfair because one day we're really advantaging one individual and the next day we're advantaging another individual. Isn't that terrible? No. And I'm obviously not saying that that's John Broome's view. It's a misapplication of his view, but it further complicates matters because exactly how this turn taking, as it were, is going to work out is going to be highly contingent and highly uncertain. But it's not at all clear that fairness demands that Georgina have some chance of being treated here. It depends upon how the system as a whole works. And moreover, one has to think about costs as opportunity costs, not just as quantities of money. The costs of treating Georgina consist of the other treatments that we're not able to provide if we expend those resources on Georgina. And fairness clearly requires of us that we think about to what extent we are responding to everyone's claims, and that entails that we have to be taking account of costs with respect to fairness, not just with respect to our overall evaluation of healthcare systems. This is basically a comment on the side. It doesn't necessarily advance the question of the allocation of healthcare, but to compare the benefits resulting from equal access to alternative allocations of healthcare in terms of deciding what would be a fair set of treatments, there must be some way of appraising changes in outcomes in healthcare. And so policymakers are going to need to rely on something such as cost effectiveness, cost value, cost benefit analysis as a starting point. It's not as if they have to choose whatever is most cost effective, but without that information about costs and effectiveness, I can't imagine how one could go about determining the strength of claims and how well they can be satisfied. If we're going to apply anything in the ballpark of a theory of fairness like Broome's, we're going to need to have that kind of information. My conclusions. First of all, a few qualms concerning the reliance on Broome's account of fairness. First of all, the point I made with respect to the toric example, the evacuation example, how can a policy that equalizes and minimizes the sacrifices individuals make fail to be fair? Secondly, as the point I just made, in an ongoing organized relationship such as a healthcare system, disparities, inequalities, apparent unfairness in one context can compensate for disparities in other contexts. Third, Broome's account says nothing about the relevance of claims of different sizes as well as strengths. And fourthly, is there any feasible way in which to proportion access to heterogeneous healthcare to the strength of heterogeneous claims to healthcare? And I don't know how to do that. Finally, here are my unhelpful principles of fairness for the distribution of healthcare. The allocation of healthcare is comparatively fair, other things being equal, if and only if access to a set of basic treatments is fair. Access to a set of basic treatments is fair, other things being equal, if and only if, first of all, it's equal. Secondly, the set of basic treatments to which individuals have access depends properly and exclusively on facts about health deficiencies and their consequences, and what treatments can accomplish at what costs. And finally, the dependence is governed by fair moral principles, principles that show what I call baseline respect. The allocation of healthcare is just if it's comparatively fair, which I defined at the top of the slide, and it requires that, other things being equal, claims to healthcare be as fully satisfied as the morally proper budget allows. I mean, the budget, of course, can be unfair itself. This account does not require that claims be satisfied in proportion to their strength. It also leaves most of the questions unanswered, for which I apologize. And with that apology, I will bring the talk to an end.
Thank you very much, Dan. So we're then coming to the question and answer period. And since we both have an audience here and online, I'm going to tell you a little about it. The first half hour will be recorded. And for you online, we will use the chat function to run the question and answer period. And so if you wish to ask a question, you should write it in the chat. And as we are a mix of researchers from different fields, and we like to ask people to ask questions from different fields, please also write your discipline. So you can write, for example, Dan philosophy, if it was Dan himself who asked the question. And we also allow for follow-up questions. So then you can write follow-up and to the person that you want to follow up to in the chat. And follow-ups are taken before new questions. And from you people here, you just put up a hand if it's a new question and a finger if it's a follow-up question. So
my chat feature is not enabled. I don't know if it's for everybody.
Sorry?
When I click chat, it doesn't work. I don't know if...
I'm sorry, Nir, I can't solve that problem now. So we will have to solve that later on. But probably it's because you didn't download the app. But you can also, since you don't have that function, you can try to put up your hand and I'll try to see it. Or put up your finger and I will try to see it. And that holds for anyone else who have problem with the chat function. At any rate, we have a number of questions. And we could start with the person who is actually partly responsible for organizing this, Anders Herlitz.
Yes. Hi, all. Thanks for a great talk, Dan. So I have a question about when you discussed the problem of the heterogeneity problem and the possibility of measuring claims with respect to quali satisfied, you said that this evaluating satisfaction of claims by looking at health outcomes was unattractive because health outcome depends on so many other things than healthcare systems. And I see how that becomes a big problem if you want to compare healthcare in different societies. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about why that is a problem for comparing healthcare within one and the same society, where all of these other features that determine health outcomes seem to be the same, sort of irrespective of what healthcare system you use.
Okay, a great question and certainly well taken. So let's imagine ourselves in the position of administrators of a universal healthcare system, and we're attempting to determine which sets of treatments will be available to everyone in our society and which treatments will be unaffordable, will not be provided by our universal healthcare system. And obviously there's going to be tremendous uncertainties and things, but let's set those to the side and suppose that we can be reasonably confident that if we provide treatment one, given the actual array of health problems in our society, we will achieve outcome one. And if we provide treatment two, we'll be able to have outcome number two. And let's suppose that outcome number one is by some measure or other, we have as a result that the distribution of health in the society itself will be less unequal. I mean, clearly we're never going to have equal health in a society, but it will be less unequal than if we provide treatment number 2. Is that going to be grounds to maintain that treatment number 1 is fairer than treatment number 2? I'm not sure about that. First of all, there's well, actually, I was going to raise a question which is important, but irrelevant about how this fits in with an overall egalitarianism where we're concerned about other things. So let's set that to the side. But it at least appears to me that it would be quite possible that well, I'm not sure whether I haven't just sort of developed your objection in a good way in sort of thinking through this. I will have to think this one over further. It seems like in a case like that, you could make the case that treatment number 1 is fairer because we wind up with a more even distribution of health outcomes. I may be wrong about that, but I think that it may be that you're correct about that, Anders. So that's not exactly an answer; it's just a repeat of a very good question.
So, Anders, were you satisfied with that answer?
Yes.
Very good. So then
you can't be satisfied with that. What are you going to be satisfied with?
But we will now have a question from somebody who was mentioned very much in your talk, Dan. John Broome, please.
Thanks very much for your very careful treatment of my theory of fairness. I appreciate it. I have little to object to in what you were saying, except the very last thing you said, because I fully recognize that what I said about fairness is very far from directly applicable to healthcare or to a great many other things, because there is so much more that needs to be put into it. And particularly, I recognize that we have to take account of the difference between strength of claims and the quantity of claims. Some person might have a very strong claim to a very small amount of antibiotic, whereas someone else might have a weaker claim to a very large amount of antibiotic. And I had no views about that. And they clearly need to be worked out. But nevertheless, I did hope that the general view of fairness, that it demands proportional satisfaction of claims, would survive in a properly worked out theory of fairness in healthcare. But the very last thing you said was, no, it doesn't. That's to say, the account that you've fully worked out actually is not consistent with the view that fairness requires proportional satisfaction of claims. Now, I think I may have, in fact, I'm sure I did miss some parts of the argument to there. So perhaps I can just ask a couple of questions. I think one of the things that led you to that conclusion was the treatment of the Volcano case. So could I just ask you to say more about what you did say about that, just to explain it a bit more? I think I just may have missed it. But as you pointed out, in the case of the Volcano, where there are 5 people at one end of the island and 95 at the other, and you can only rescue those at one or those at the other, I do think that perfect fairness can only be achieved by rescuing nobody, and that does seem to me perfectly fair. And I also think that a second degree of fairness, which I called surrogate fairness, can be achieved by tossing a coin, which gives everybody a 50% chance of being saved. Though, as you very fairly said, I don't recommend either of those courses of action. I recommend sending people to the north, but that's only because that saves so many more lives. That completely outweighs the goodness of the fairness that can be achieved. But you said I shouldn't even think that giving everybody an equal chance is fair in a surrogate way. And it was something to do with what happens to the worse off. And I'm afraid I missed it. So could you say that again and see if I'll try and get a handle on it this time?
Sure. And I actually think that this criticism isn't nearly as germane to the question of the applicability of your views to healthcare as the other issues I raised. But with respect to this, what I was doing was sketching an alternative account of fairness. The alternative account of fairness is basically a veil of ignorance view of fairness, that if in an from an ex-ante perspective, you would have unanimity favoring one policy as opposed to another, and moreover, you can argue that the worst off in one distribution as opposed to another is no worse off. That it's always hard to say these things, get the quantifier right. That the worst off group with one choice is no worse off than the worst off group with another choice. And moreover, the favored choice minimizes the number of individuals who are worst off. That if we've satisfied those conditions, we're doing things fairly. And that, of course, is inconsistent with flipping a coin and giving an equal chance to saving the 100 as opposed to saving the 5. So the idea is that there's a competing notion of fairness here, which is arguably more plausible. Ultimately, it reaches the same moral conclusion that you reach, taking all the considerations into account. But that, I mean, the argument crudely is, look, if everybody agrees to it, and moreover, it doesn't make it doesn't lead to a worse off group being still worse off, and moreover minimizes the number of people worse off, that's got to be fair. So that's the argument.
Good, thank you. Okay, I see it better now. So can I respond to it?
Please.
Sure.
Veil of ignorance argument, as I would see them done correctly, which is the way that Hausman does them, are going to lead to the conclusion in favor of utilitarianism. And I know, of course I know, that my account of fairness is in conflict with the outcome recommended by utilitarianism. So I'm not going to be really impressed by a veil of ignorance argument, even though I know Rawls thought of it as fairness. It may be an account of justice as Rawls understands it, but I don't think it's a good account of fairness. I mean, the difficulty we're in now is that I'm making quite a sharp division between fairness, which is a sort of good, and other sorts of goods, which I would think of as utilitarian sorts of goods. And I think that the veil of ignorance argument pertains well to the other sort, but it doesn't pertain to fairness. But anyhow, look, can I ask you some more then? Because you said that this was not particularly germane to your argument, and I hadn't appreciated that, because when you had a slide which was germane to the argument because it listed what you see as fairness, and number one on there on that slide. I didn't have time to write down exactly what it says, but it was something to do with if there's an outcome or a procedure that leads to good for everybody, then how could that possibly be unfair? And that was, I thought, that was a substantive part of your objection to mine. So I wondered what is an example of that where there is something that's good for everybody that would be rated as unfair according to me.
Well, in terms of just raising questions about your account of fairness, clearly the evacuation example was a question about your account of fairness. And the first point on my slide of various qualms about either the misapplication of your views or the relevance of your views with respect to healthcare, the first point there was in fact just referring back to the evacuation example. There's nothing different in the first point. The other points were, first of all, which I think can certainly be encompassed by your view, but isn't something that you specifically addressed, that basically the turn-taking issue, that we can't look at things in isolation, which in fact don't operate in isolation, but as part of a continuing activity. That with respect to healthcare, if we're thinking about equal access, it would be very difficult, and indeed it seems to me for a variety of reasons, indeed impossible to operationalize your view in a context like that. I've actually forgotten what the last point on the slide was. I'd have to go back. Perhaps someone else has it down, but there was a fourth point there.
Yeah.
Okay, but now if the first point was referring back to the volcano, then what you must have been saying is how could the solution of rescuing the 95 possibly count as unfair? And I'll tell you the answer to that. It's unfair to the remaining 5 because they could say they never had a chance. They were never given a chance of rescue and everybody else was. So that's the answer to that one. And perhaps I shouldn't take too much time, but perhaps I could just say I would be disappointed if the true account of fairness in healthcare turned out to be irreconcilable with my view of fairness. And it seems to me the thing is, there's so much empty space in my view of fairness that there's lots of room for recognizing them. Because one thing that I didn't, people justifiably complain about that, I gave no account of what determines people's claims.
Right.
So what their claims to. I mean, I have a general idea about what claims are to. I think mostly in practice they're to resources rather than to well-being. But that's sort of about the only thing that I say. So, I mean, it may be that what people have claims to is access to a range of healthcare facilities. Maybe that's what we all have claims to, and maybe we all have equal claims to. In that case, it's fair if we all get equal access. So that would be consistent with what you say. But then at the very last moment, you said, but my theory is inconsistent with that. I don't suppose that, well, maybe you can say very quickly why that is.
Dan can quickly answer, and then we also have some follow-up questions. But Dan, please.
Yeah.
Well, very quickly, if individuals have claims to of differing strength to healthcare, then providing equal access, it will be inconsistent with satisfying their claims proportional to their strength. But you were suggesting maybe we can then say everyone has equal claims to access, and that would solve the problem. But of course, that's going to require further argument.
Okay, so then we have two follow-up questions. One is actually from me. It's just a question of clarification, and it's both to John and to Dan. So is the idea in the rescue case that there's only one fair solution, or can there be many fair solutions? I mean, sometimes we talk about surrogate when equal chances, that's just a surrogate. Or is it that one fair solution is to save no one, another fair solution is to have this equal chances, and it could be more like equal chance to determine the outcome or something like that. So I'm a little bit lost here in your discussion.
As I read John's view, there's one uniquely fair thing to do, which is to save no one. But there's a kind of backup where the outcome isn't fair, but the way in which we're treating individuals determining that outcome is fair, and that is to give everyone an equal chance on the assumption that each of these individuals have an equal claim. I don't think there's further fairnesses to be found beyond those, as I understand John's view.
So I don't see why not giving equal chance to everybody to determine the outcome would also be fair. Why wouldn't that be, or surrogate fair in the same way?
Well, I mean, I guess I don't understand under the circumstance.
Let me explain it a little bit better. So let's say that you give everyone gets a ticket, and you can pull a ticket. It can either be my ticket or John's ticket or your ticket. So everybody has one chance in 100 to determine the outcome, if you assume that there was 100 people in total.
I'm sorry. I'm not understanding how this is going to work. So each individual pulls a ticket that says north or south on it.
Yeah, and with their name on it. Yeah.
Right, but that's not the choice that faces the Coast Guard captain. They can either go to the north or to the south.
No, that's still the choice. It's just going to be determined that we are pulling one ticket, and that says John Broome,
so we're
go
just
to the south.
We're just pulling a single ticket here. Yeah. So we're basically running a heavily weighted lottery.
Yeah, but it will be equal chances for everyone to actually determine the outcome, that their view determines the outcome. 1 in 100.
Right, but well, I don't think anyone. I think that's an odd way to describe it, because no one has a chance of determining the outcome. What you're describing is something that's simply equivalent to putting 105 names in a drum, pulling one name out, and that simply determines whether you go to the north or south, and that's just a weighted lottery. No one has any power to determine anything like determine the outcome there.
Well, it's going to be a factor of matter that actually it was John's vote or ticket determined what we're going to do, and everyone has 1 in 105 chances to be that person. That's just a matter of fact.
Well, I think probably we should discuss this particular example of yours as separately, because it doesn't seem to me that the way you're describing it is an account where everyone is being treated fairly in any regard, but. I guess I'm not really following.
Okay,
that.
We should go on with that. My idea was fairly because give everyone equal chance of determining the outcome. But anyway, we have more fingers, so we should go on. So I think it's Daniel now.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I just wanted to point out that there's also another position, another ex-ante position. So you talked, for example, about an agreement, and I think one could imagine, like the Coast Guard could imagine, hypothetical agreement among the people being rescued if it's true that each of them ends up in one or the other position with equal likelihood on the island, right? I can, like, this kind of agreement I can imagine, and then the Coast Guard just rescues the greater number because that is what the principle that they could have agreed to. But if it's actually not true that they all had the equal chance, so for example, they are like the 5 are loners, they never go in bigger groups. Like by birth, for example, they are born loners, they don't like other people that much. They wouldn't have agreed to it ex ante, right? Not on this hypothetical case. I know this is not the veil of ignorance that you suggested, but there's this immediate position where sometimes we might allow to rescue the greater number, but sometimes not, if it's actually not true that there was ever a chance of them, equal chance of them ending up in the bigger group.
Well, what I had in mind was what's determining the general policy of the Coast Guard, and whether that general policy would be fair or not fair. And the question that's being posed here is not the question if there were a volcano on an island with a larger number on one end to the other end to be saved, what would the policy be? We're talking about something much more general. Should there be a general policy for the Coast Guard of saving as many individuals as they can? And I was arguing that if that's the question, that there's an answer there, which is basically, it's like a utilitarian answer. It's like the answer that Hausman gives with respect to a general veil of ignorance argument. But unlike the circumstances which leads Rawls to criticize Hausman's outcome, we no longer have the case that you can argue that, well, but this is making the worst off individual, that this is benefiting individuals at the potential cost of those at the bottom. We're not benefiting individuals at the cost of those at the bottom of the cost, at the cost of those who are worst off, because the worst off are, with this policy, are doing just as well as the worst off with any other policy, and indeed we're minimizing those. So now, I mean, if one wants to think of another problem where you're addressing a single specific issue, and where some individuals know that they're going to be harmed in those issues, then you may want to give a completely different answer. And so I wasn't attempting to argue that under every circumstance, some sort of a veil of ignorance argument is going to give us a fair outcome. Indeed, I think there are certain circumstances where it won't give us a fair outcome, but that in this particular circumstance, it appeared to be at least a viable competitor to Broome's view of fairness. And indeed, I think it certainly is a viable competitor, and one which is plausibly superior to Broome's what Broome has to say, although obviously the ultimate moral decision you would make would wind up being the same, regardless of which of these two theories of fairness you were to endorse.
Yeah. I guess I was suggesting yet another viable competitor. I was wondering what you think about that. But it's I'm happy with the answer. Thanks.
Okay, so then the next question is Yukiko. See? There.
Unmute.
Yukiko?
Oh,
Yeah.
am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dan. I have two comments question. One is that is it possible to just limit your consideration to healthcare? And do you have to worry about more social care? The reason why I'm asking is that earlier in the slide, I think, and I saw that when we talk about health, you're thinking about suffering and function. And then there always the case that we cannot, it's just not possible to fix someone by healthcare. And in that case, compensation or to bring someone better is not the healthcare, but it's the outside of healthcare. So in that case, I'm wondering that the healthcare, access to healthcare, fairness of it is already difficult, but maybe we need to think in an expansive way. And then if that's the case, maybe we need to worry about what is the claim too that we're worried about. Is it claim to be fixed or claim to function as a person who can contribute to the society or some kind? So that's one question. The other is then what you mentioned about turn taking. I do understand that then sometimes it's unfortunate and it's this time we got in some situation that then we need a more expensive healthcare, and in other times it's not. But I don't think it's random. That the empirical studies show that those unfortunate events of the health event falls more onto the socioeconomically disadvantaged. So with that evidence, would you still say that the turn taking is the viable way to think about it? Thank you.
Okay, wonderful questions. I mean, if we're thinking, I think you're absolutely right that we might ask a much more general question, not what's the fairest way to allocate healthcare, but what's the fairest way to organize society overall. And I'm having enough trouble with allocating healthcare, with moving to the larger question. I mean, what one can do is say, holding fixed the social determinants of health and other environmental factors that are affecting health in society. Within that context, what's the fairest way of allocating healthcare, recognizing that you are operating in a context of, certainly not a context of ideal theory. You're operating in a context of definitely a second or third best solution. And that maybe what you should be doing is, instead of thinking about allocating healthcare fairly in this context, but rather changing the context. So I'm not sure that makes things any easier, but it does definitely raise questions about whether one should be focusing so much on the allocation of healthcare. With respect to turn taking, it's the data you cite is obviously certainly correct. It's certainly the case that those who lose out in one context tend to be those who lose out in other contexts. And just look at the pandemic; those who've already done very poorly in terms of health are clearly doing worse with respect to the pandemic. Nevertheless, I mean, I think if my argument were, don't care about any disparities, it'll all come right in the end, it'll all wash out. If that were the argument, I think that would be a decisive criticism against it. But if it's the narrow argument of don't simply look at the response to a particular problem on a particular time without recognizing that tomorrow the roles might be reversed, I don't think it's an objection to my concerns with an overly narrow focus on just a particular allocational question.
On that note, I'm afraid, Mike, and we have run over time because there are so many questions. And I first would like to apologize to those people who are still on the list. You've been unfairly treated according to any reasonable theory of fairness, but we are unfortunately out of time. So please join me and thank Dan for this lovely talk and very thought-provoking talk, obviously, given all the questions. This is the last seminar for the term here. We are back on the 21st of January, and there will also be more seminars in collaboration with Rutgers, which I very much look forward to. Thank you very much.